In the Old West, the law was just an empty word, a distant idea that rarely reached the cities and towns scattered across this inhospitable land. The frontier towns, unlike what civilization suggested, were true cauldrons of chaos and violence. The land promised to those seeking freedom became, for many, a place of daily survival. Territorial disputes, the lack of central authority, and the constant threats from outlaws created an environment where brute force was the only way to maintain order. As the West expanded, conflicts between gangs were constant. Armed men, willing to do anything to protect their land or claim what they wanted, put even more pressure on those trying to simply live and work. The towns were dominated by small groups of criminals, the so-called outlaws, who imposed their own version of the law. The population, fearful and without options, was at the mercy of these bands, and often resorted to fleeing or remaining silent, hoping the chaos wouldn't hit them directly. In this setting, figures like Wyatt Earp emerged, who refused to accept the absence of authority. Unlike most men of the time, who adapted or bowed down to the violence, Earp believed that justice should be restored, and he was willing to fight for it. His name would soon become synonymous with courage and strength, and his quest for justice would place him at the center of the battle between order and chaos, between those who held power and those who were merely trying to survive. But how would he become a name that echoed across the West? The Wild West, then, was not just a stage for gang clashes or a lawless land. It was a testing ground for those who dared to act, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Wyatt Earp, with his firm character and unwavering sense of justice, would be the man to challenge the very essence of this ruthless world. His story would become an example of how a single man could, with courage and determination, try to dominate chaos and turn the Wild West into a place where the law was more than just an empty word. Wyatt Earp was born in a time of great change at the end of the 19th century, in a region marked by territorial expansion and the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. From a young age, Wyatt was a witness to the chaos that consumed the frontier towns. His early experiences were shaped by this atmosphere of violence and insecurity. He grew up in a family that constantly moved, which gave him a unique understanding of the instability of the West. His early experiences didn't suggest he would become a legendary figure, but rather just another man trying to survive in this hostile environment. Over time, Wyatt Earp adapted to life in the Old West, working as a barman, miner, and even as a police officer in small towns. His law enforcement experience began to stand out when he became involved in confrontations with criminals and strategically began aligning himself with influential figures of the time. Earp was not just an ordinary man. He was someone who began to understand the dynamics of power in frontier towns and how the lack of a formal justice system created fertile ground for chaos. As he became involved in law enforcement, Wyatt Earp didn't just limit himself to arresting criminals. He understood that his influence was tied to how he interacted with the people around him. With almost intuitive skill, he managed to establish relationships with politicians, business owners, and other influential figures of the time, creating a support network that would be essential for his future rise. His name began to be recognized, and as he maintained order in one town after another, his reputation grew, making him a respected and feared name. But Wyatt Earp's rise was not a smooth journey. He faced various challenges, from gang attacks to the resistance of other sheriffs who saw him as a threat to their local power. Earp knew that the only way to ensure his survival and consolidate his position was to become more than just a simple sheriff. He needed to be a man who shaped the destiny of those who crossed his path. And so, little by little, the figure of Wyatt Earp transformed from a simple lawman to a true leader of an empire on the rise. The OK Corral shootout is undoubtedly the most emblematic event in Wyatt Earp's life, a moment that solidified his figure as one of the greatest sheriffs of the Old West. On October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona, the tension between the Earps, accompanied by their friend Doc Holliday, and the Clanton and McClory gang reached its boiling point. What seemed to be just another confrontation between outlaws and the law turned into one of the most famous shootouts in American history. The clash was quick, bloody, and for many represented the symbol of an era where violence was the only answer to resolve disputes. Wyatt Earp, along with his brothers Virgil and Morgan and Doc Holliday, faced a significant numerical disadvantage. However, what they lacked in numbers, they made up for with experience, precision, and unwavering moral conviction. The battle was brief but intense. 4 members of the opposing gang were killed, while the Earps and Holliday walked away from the shootout with only a few injuries. This event not only solidified Earp's reputation as an unbeatable man, but also created a legend that would echo throughout the West. Earp's ability to face death head-on while maintaining his stance on justice turned him from a local sheriff into a national hero. The OK Corral shootout was not only an event of violence, but also a reflection of the harsh reality of the Old West. It was a fight for survival, where the law was unclear and the line between good and evil was blurred. For many, Wyatt Earp's actions represented the triumph of justice, while for others, it was the embodiment of the brutality of a justice system that existed on the fringes of civilization. The shootout was a turning point not only for Wyatt Earp, but for an entire generation that saw in the West the true measure of courage and strength. However, the shootout also brought with it a series of consequences that would forever change Wyatt Earp's life. From that moment on, he would become a divisive figure. To his allies, he was a hero. To his enemies, a man who had brought an end to a wild and relentless way of life. The line between law and crime was becoming ever thinner, and Wyatt Earp, with his growing fame, would be confronted with a series of dilemmas that would test his principles and loyalty. What began as a simple act of justice in the name of the law would turn Wyatt Earp into a legend with a price to pay. After the famous OK Corral shootout, Wyatt Earp was no longer just a local sheriff. He became a legend of the Old West. His figure as an uncompromising, just and unbeatable man was reinforced by how he dealt with the violence and gangs that plagued the towns. As sheriff of Tombstone, his authority was challenged by many, but the shootout itself and his subsequent actions placed him on a pedestal where justice, often blind, was enforced relentlessly. Wyatt Earp, with his rigid morals, showed the world that the law could be executed by force, if necessary, and that he wouldn't hesitate to act. However, Wyatt Earp's rise as an icon of the law did not come without controversy. He was constantly embroiled in political disputes, especially with other figures of the local government, like Sheriff Johnny Behan, who was allied with the Clanton gang. Earp wasn't just a man of action, he was a strategist, always looking for ways to consolidate his power and ensure that order was maintained. His ability to form alliances with local businessmen and politicians was crucial in securing the stability he sought. However, this very power he began to build would make him more and more the target of criticism, as many saw him as someone who controlled more than he should. As his influence grew, Wyatt Earp became a central figure in negotiations and decisions both inside and outside the town. He wasn't just a sheriff, he was an agent of the system who knew how to manipulate situations to his favor. His ability to do business, often using unconventional methods, and his constant struggle to establish order amidst chaos showed that his ambition went beyond simply enforcing the law. He was building an empire, a network of power that expanded with every town he visited, every dispute he resolved, and every ally he won. However, This rise didn't come without resistance. Wyatt Earp had to face not only the gangs that threatened the peace, but also rivalries with other sheriffs and, of course, the desire of some influential figures to bring him down. His journey wasn't just a quest for justice. It was a constant struggle for power, and like any great leader, Wyatt had to make tough choices. Every decision he made brought him closer to creating an empire, but it also put him in the path of enemies who would challenge his morals and principles. Wyatt Earp's strategic ability was not limited to the realm of justice and law enforcement. As his reputation grew, he realized that true power in the Old West did not come solely from physical strength or shooting skills, but from the ability to manipulate the political and social structures around him. With a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve, Wyatt began to build his empire through carefully crafted alliances with local politicians, businessmen, and other influential figures. He knew that to maintain power, he needed to be more than just a sheriff. He needed to be an archetype of leadership that transcended official authority. One of the strategies Wyatt Earp used masterfully was his ability to negotiate and form alliances with those who could help him expand his network of influence. He befriended businessmen who had vested interests in the region's growth and who needed order to ensure the continuity of their businesses. At the same time, he made contacts with other local leaders, manipulating the political games in a quiet but effective way. These alliances not only ensured his survival, but also gave him access to resources vital for consolidating his empire. Furthermore, Wyatt Earp knew how to use his own image to solidify his power. He was seen not just as a sheriff, but as a man. Above all, someone who was not confined by conventional laws. His reputation as someone who didn't hesitate to bring justice at any cost helped shape the narrative about him, making his presence a symbol of power. This image of inflexibility and courage attracted followers and allies, and more importantly, intimidated those who could be his enemies. With every town he visited, Wyatt Earp's name grew stronger, his empire more solid. However, building his empire wasn't without its challenges. Each new alliance brought with it a new set of expectations and responsibilities, and Wyatt had to navigate these murky waters with skill and, at times, sheer necessity. He knew how to exploit the weaknesses of his enemies while using his own strengths to manipulate local politics to his advantage. Like a true strategist, he used the chaos that dominated the Old West to create a power network that gave him increasing control over the region's destiny. As Wyatt Earp consolidated his power in the Old West, he soon realized that in a world where law was a constant battle, alliances were fragile and betrayals were inevitable. What began as a quest for justice amid the chaos of the Wild West soon transformed into an unrelenting fight against those who sought to bring him down. His empire, which had been carefully built, now faced increasing resistance from both internal and external enemies. Many saw him as a threat to their own power, and it didn't take long for figures within his own circle to attempt to sabotage him. The primary betrayal that marked Wyatt Earp's journey came after the OK Corral shootout, when he found himself in conflict with several allies who had previously supported his quest for justice. Sheriff Johnny Behan, for example, was a figure who opposed Earp on numerous occasions, allying himself with factions that sought to undermine Wyatt's authority. While Earp sought to maintain order, Behan, with his own political agenda, associated with local gangs and other enemies to weaken Earp's influence. This clash between the two men became one of the greatest political and personal battles of the Old West, with Wyatt Earp being forced to use all the means at his disposal to protect his name and empire. However, betrayal also came from within his own circle. Men who had long been loyal allies began to act erratically or betray Wyatt for their own interests. Even Doc Holliday, one of Earp's closest friends, had his loyalty tested on several occasions. Internal disputes, combined with external attacks, turned Wyatt Earp's life into a constant struggle for survival and the maintenance of his empire. Each betrayal he faced only made him more determined not to fall, but at the same time he knew he was surrounded by enemies willing to do anything to see his downfall. These betrayals and the enemies that appeared at every corner forged the true nature of Wyatt Earp's empire. The political warfare and constant need to protect his authority caused him to question his own morality and the way he viewed justice. The lines between right and wrong began to blur, and the man who once saw justice as his greatest goal started to lose himself in a game of power, where the ends justified the means. Like all great leaders, Wyatt Earp had to make tough decisions. But as he advanced, the consequences of his choices became heavier, placing him in a position where justice and power were in constant conflict. Wyatt Earp's journey in the Old West was marked by a meteoric rise, but also an inevitable fall. As he consolidated his power, the sheriff became an increasingly influential figure, not only in the small towns he governed, but also in the major political decisions shaping the region. His ability to manipulate circumstances and play the power game, always with his uncompromising morals, made him one of the most feared and respected men in the West. But like all empires, what rises quickly tends to fall even faster, and the choices Earp made along his journey began to take their toll. The end of his rise was not caused only by external enemies, but also by the very nature of the Old West. The environment he helped shape, with its constant struggles for control and influence, began to turn against him. The Wild West, which initially seemed like a place without rules and laws, gradually began to change. New political forces started to emerge, new forms of power were being built, and the figure of the invincible sheriff started to lose its relevance. Wyatt Earp, a figure so emblematic of that time, found himself trapped between what he was and what the West was becoming. Furthermore, the betrayals and internal conflicts that Wyatt had dealt with throughout his career began to wear him down. The allies he had gained over the years began to drift away, and the constant pressure of external threats left Earp increasingly vulnerable. His deteriorating health, coupled with the growing sense of weariness and helplessness in the face of new forms of government and power, made the figure of the great sheriff begin to crumble. The empire he had built based on personal power and fragile alliances collapsed when he found himself isolated and increasingly distanced from his former allies and the old power structure that dominated the West. Wyatt Earp's fall was not a sudden event, but rather a gradual process that slowly eroded his strength and influence. His final years, far from the glory he once experienced, were marked by an incessant search for a quieter life, away from the threats he had helped create. However, the shadow of his empire still lingered over the West. His legend endured, but the man who built it was far from the invincible hero he once was. The rise and fall of Wyatt Earp reflected the ephemeral nature of power in the Old West, where even the greatest figures could be swallowed by their own ambition. Wyatt Earp's legacy is still one of the most debated and controversial in the history of the Old West. While some view him as a hero who brought order to an uncontrolled territory, others consider him a figure who used the power of the law to build a personal empire, manipulating the rules to suit his convenience. Regardless of the divergent opinions about his morality, the fact remains that his story shaped the public perception of what it meant to be a sheriff in the West. His legend transcended time, being revered, retold, and even distorted over the decades, whether in movies, books, or even historical accounts. Wyatt Earp is undoubtedly one of the most emblematic figures of the Old West, a symbol of justice, but also of unbridled ambition. His rise to power and eventual fall served as the foundation for countless narratives about the Wild West, a place where power was contested with blood, courage, and often flexible morality. But at the same time, his legend raises important questions about the costs of power. How much is justice worth when it is used to protect personal interests? How far can one go in the name of order without losing sight of the principles that support it? The impact of Wyatt Earp goes beyond the borders of the Old West. His name became synonymous with authority, resistance, and the quest for order in a place where laws were mere suggestions. He was the sheriff who faced immense challenges, not only from outlaws and criminal factions, but also from a system that was unprepared to deal with figures as powerful and complex as he was. Over the years, Earp's story inspired not only other leaders of the West, but also served as the basis for creating heroes and villains in literature and cinema, creating a timeless narrative about the fight for justice. Despite the criticisms and doubts about his choices throughout his life, Wyatt Earp's legacy is undoubtedly that of a man who challenged the norms, became more than just a figure of authority, and through his actions altered the course of the history of the Wild West. His name remains a trademark of the Old West, not only because of the strength of his presence, but because of how he was able to manipulate circumstances to create an empire that, although flawed and fleeting, will never be forgotten.